Greetings. Today is June 25th, 2024. My name is Atimaneda George. I'm a Green Fellow with the American Folklife Center, and today I have the pleasure of welcoming Cynthia Farrell Johnson. Cynthia, please tell us your origin story.
Well, my origin story begins in New York City, but in fact, actually, it goes a little farther back. My parents were immigrants. So they were born in Panama, and their parents migrated to Panama from Barbados and Jamaica. So I grew up in a household where I heard lots of stories about back home, whether it was from my Barbadian grandmother on my father's side or from both of my parents and their friends who would get together for visits, sometimes after church on Saturdays. My family was Seventh-day Adventist. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and we attended a church that was predominantly people from the Caribbean. And they were strivers. Everybody worked really hard. And at one point, the church put together a credit union because, as is so often the case in Black communities, it was really difficult to get credit. So they set up a credit union to help people with car loans, house mortgages. And I even benefited from it because my first semester of graduate school was the contents of my credit union account at that church. So it was a church where we heard many accents and stories from faraway places. So from the very beginning, I was always curious about the wider world. And in my community in Bedford-Stuyvesant, there was a library in the middle of Tompkins Park, one of those Carnegie libraries, a beautiful old building, nestled in the middle of this park, surrounded by trees. I would go there often and sit in one of these corners and read fairy tales from faraway lands and all kinds of other stories of faraway places. So from a very early age, I was curious about the world and liked to read about it, ask my grandmother to tell me stories she used to read to me before I could read for myself. So it was a nurturing household, but also one where creativity was encouraged. My father sang. That was his passion. Music was his passion. So he got training and actually was a voice for hire on Sundays because he went to church on Saturdays. And his day job was a printer. And sometimes I would go to work with him and he would show me some of the tricks of the trade, like how to make yellow really pop. You add a little bit of red and a little bit of white. So I learned all kinds of things from him along the way. And my mom was my first art teacher. She used to carry a little pad and pencil in her purse. And if I got too fidgety in church, she would draw a picture, then give it to me and say, now it's your turn. And I would get lost in drawing this picture and therefore would stop fidgeting. And, for a little kid sitting listening to a sermon about fire and brimstone, it was not usually something that engaged me. So this was her way of keeping me quiet, but it also began my journey into the arts. She also was an incredible seamstress, and before she went to work full time, she used to make all of our clothes. She would make the patterns out of newspaper or grocery bags and design clothing for beautiful little dresses. And I used to love going with her to one of the shops where she bought fabric and notions and trims and things. Red was my favorite color. I always loved vivid colors. So that was a household I grew up in. Interest in the world, interest in the arts. She sang, my mom sang as well as my father. They used to do duets at church sometimes. So it was just a very musical family. And one of my warmest memories from childhood was when my father would take the subway up to Harlem, the Harlem YMCA, and pick up Lawrence Brown, who had been the arranger and accompanist for Paul Robeson, and bring him to the house for Sunday dinner, and they would rehearse. And as a child, of course, I had no idea how important Mr. Brown was. He was just this wonderful old man who made lots of jokes and argued with my grandmother at the, at the dinner table. And so later on in life, when I heard some of the Paul Robeson recordings with Mr. Brown, I realized that my father was a dead ringer for Paul Robeson. And so that's why so many people were always so excited when the two of them performed in churches and concert halls around town or in other parts of the country. So I don't know if that sort of gives you a sense of where I began my life
Yes,
journey.
that is wonderful. And you had mentioned graduate school, but would you talk to us a little bit about your undergraduate experience and then what led you to the Foreign Service?
Well, to do that, let me go back to high school. I attended a vocational high school for commercial art in New York City. At the time, it was located on 57th Street and 2nd Avenue, which was in the heart of the advertising district. And my intention was after I finished there to find a job doing commercial art. Well, my father was having none of that. He said, "You will go to college, so just start looking." And I applied to different schools and ended up going to State University of New York, the college at New Paltz. And of course, because I had worked as a library assistant during high school, that was my part time after school job. When I got to college, I looked for a work study job in the library and found one in what was then the World Study Center in the Sojourner Truth Library at New Paltz. And in the World Study Center, they had a large collection called the Haggerty Collection, which was, I think, foundational materials from a gentleman who had been very involved in world studies. And at that time, New Paltz had an area studies program where they had students studying about China, Latin America, Africa, different parts of the world. So they had this collection, in addition to the Haggerty collection, they had books on Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, Latin America, just all in a certain section. And then they had magazines, all the different magazines from all parts of the world. So I got to read Drum Magazine and all kinds of other magazines from Africa and Asia. And so that also sparked my curiosity about the world. And I was an art history major because at first I had wanted to study art education and be an art teacher. And I took a class on art education and decided maybe I didn't want to be in a classroom. And so I said, well, maybe I'll do librarianship because I really was interested in libraries and enjoyed working in libraries and helping people find information. So the librarian in the World Study Center had just come back from a Fulbright in South Africa and encouraged me to consider foreign service. She gave me a booklet. Well, I looked at the first part of it about State Department, and it was about economic officer, political officer, admin officer. So people who studied the politics of different countries, economics of different countries. The admin officers were the administrative managers who made sure the trains ran on time and people got their shipments and all kinds of things of that nature, and that the embassies functioned. And then there were the consular officers who helped people, either Americans who were living abroad or the immigrants who were coming to the US who wanted to migrate, or visitors who wanted a visa to come visit the US. And I looked at all of those and said, no, I don't think so. I didn't look at the rest of the brochure. If I had, I would have seen things about the US Information Agency, the Department of Commerce, and all of that. But for some reason, I just stopped after I saw State Department and said, oh, well, this is not for me, because I was more interested in arts and culture. So anyway, as an art history major, I had to take a foreign language. So I took German because French seemed too hard. And spent a summer abroad in Germany, my junior summer, which was fascinating and showed me that there are many other ways of being in the world, not just what we experience in the US. And so I decided I needed to find a job that would allow me to experience other cultures and experience other ways of living because I just was so fascinated by this concept, which meant, okay, if I wanted to be a librarian, I needed to go to graduate school and get a master's in library science. But I also was thinking maybe I could find a job where I could do that overseas, but I wasn't quite sure how I could find that kind of job. Anyway, I went to graduate school. I had no clue how I was going to pay for it. I remember I mentioned that I had used my last bits of funds to pay for the first semester of graduate school. But Providence was with me. A friend who lives on the Upper West Side told me about a job opening at Barnard College in her newsletter. I went, applied, and got the job. And one of the benefits of the job was that they would pay for any graduate school one went to because they didn't have a graduate school. I think this was before there was some kind of merger agreement with Columbia University. So I was attending Pratt Institute's graduate library school, which is one of the oldest library schools in the country. And because I lived 2 blocks from there, so it just seemed to make sense. So I went to graduate school, got my library degree, and was working at Barnard College. I guess the spring semester of that year, of my first year working there, the senior librarian, returned from a Fulbright. He had been on a Fulbright in the Philippines, helping them build their library collection or some kind of consulting with them on their library collection. And so he said, since you like languages and you like travel, you should look into the US Information Agency because they have libraries overseas. So I did. I wrote to the U.S. Information Agency's, I guess, the recruitment office, and didn't hear anything for over a year. And finally got, I think, a phone call asking me if I was still interested in learning more about Foreign Service opportunities. Apparently, my letter had ended up at the bottom of somebody's inbox and died there. And a new person was assigned to the job and went through it and found it. So Beverly Hendricks, kind lady, asked me if I was still interested, and I said yes. And she sent me a packet of information. And to my disappointment, I learned that librarians needed 5 years of experience before they'd be considered for jobs in the U.S. Information Agency. However, there was other information about Foreign Service generalist officers who could do cultural work, press work, all kinds of other types of work involving academic exchanges and things of that nature. So, yes, that seemed really doable. They had a special minority recruitment program because they were trying to increase the number of people of color in Foreign Service at U.S. Information Agency. And I applied. You had to fill out this long federal form. This was in the pre-internet days, so long federal form. And I had to send transcript from undergraduate, graduate school, and write essays and all kinds of things for them to decide whether or not they wanted to take a chance on me.
Excuse me, what year was that?
This was 1979 when I wrote. Now, I think I may have written in 78 when I was still in graduate school. So I had graduated and I was now working at Brooklyn Public Library, but I filled out all this paperwork. A few months later, I got another call from Beverly saying, well, we're still waiting to get your graduate school transcripts. So I went through and looked at my canceled checks. Those are things you used to get back in the day. And saw that Pratt Institute had canceled it, but the USIA had received nothing. So I walked over there with my canceled check, waving it, saying, could you please give me my graduate school transcript? Which they did with apologies. So I sent it off, and a few months later, I was invited to do the oral exam. I can't remember when I did those. It was,
Was it in
yeah,
New
it
York?
was 79 still.
Okay. In New York?
No, I had to go to Washington.
Okay.
And again, spirits smiled on me because I had a dear friend who went to Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And I stayed with her, and she gave me all kinds of tips on what to do at the orals because, of course, she had gotten this from her school, part of their program. And so I went to the orals, taking the metro for the first time and trying not to get lost, but I made it there on time. And it was very different from what they do. Not really different, but it was different enough from what they do today. At that point, you had a one-on-one interview with someone. You had an in-basket test. You had a group exercise. I think those were the things. It was an all-day event at any rate. And I remember in the months leading up to it, spending so much time reading the New York Times and anything else I could get my hands on world affairs so that it could be somewhat coherent if asked anything about any of the trouble spots of the world. So, of course, they didn't ask me about any of those. I get a question from the examiner on Canada. What are some of the bilateral irritants or problems between Canada and the US, and what might be done to address them? I just looked at him and said, I have no idea. And he said, no, that's okay. Think about it for a while. And I said, oh, yes. I remember reading an article in Kirkus magazine about how the Canadian government had established a program to promote works, written works, literary works by Canadian writers. I mean, I think it was some kind of, there was some kind of benefit that people could accrue from purchasing books by Canadian authors because their market was so flooded with American art authors that it was crowding out the local creative class. And so I said, well, that could probably be extended to other areas where the US is dominating and things that are either made in Canada or by Canadians do get overshadowed. And I said, what was the rest of the question? And he said, no, that's fine. So then he asked me, what would you do if you were in a country where there's no television, mainly only radio? What would you do for entertainment? And I said, oh, that's no problem. I would paint. That's what I do. I sketch, paint, and make art. And so he said, oh, what kind of art do you make? I said, well, people compare it to Haitian art because I do scenes from everyday life. And he said, oh, that's interesting. My wife and I have a collection of Haitian art that we lent to the Brooklyn Museum for an exhibition. I said, oh, yes, I saw that show. That was amazing. So we just had this wonderful conversation. So when I related all of this to my friend after I got back home, she was like, you're in, no worries, you're in. But of course, they didn't tell you that day. Back then, you had to wait. And so it was weeks before I got results that I had been successful and that the next step would be the security clearance, the background check. So they explained what that was going to be like, that somebody would come and check with your neighbors and ask questions about you. So I went and told my neighbors that somebody might be coming to ask questions about me and that it was okay because I was applying for a job in the government. And then months later, one of my neighbors came up to me and said, "I'm so glad you told me that these people were coming around because I would have told them it was none of their business. You're a nice girl." Anyway, so that was kind of how that all began. And it was months and months before I heard anything more about next steps, and then was given 2 weeks to pack up and get to Washington.
Wow. So you finally entered on duty when?
February of 1980.
Mm.
And I stayed with another friend who lived in downtown DC in a neighborhood that has since been gentrified. She lived in Shaw, but she lived in Shaw when it was a really rough neighborhood, and there was a house of where strange activities took place next door to her. It was a nice and convenient neighborhood, but there were some issues with crime, and we were broken into at least once while I was living there with her. It was pretty awful, but such is life. But I came in 1980, and USIA, the U.S. Information Agency, had its entry-level training program, and then we joined with State Department after a certain number of weeks and did the same kinds of welcome to diplomacy kinds of training with the what they call A100, the new class of junior officer trainees.
So what was your first assignment in the Foreign Service?
Well, when we got our list of options, I decided I wanted to learn French and that I wanted to go someplace that I normally wouldn't be able to go on my own because of expense. And I wasn't sure this was a career for me. So I figured maybe I'll give it 5 years. So let's see what happens. I applied to different French-speaking West African countries and was fortunate to get my first choice, which was Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, which everyone told me was a wonderful place. So I was really thrilled to be able to do that, and thus started French language training soon thereafter, and also area studies where I learned more about West Africa and all the different cultural and political and social issues of the day in that region, and U.S. relationships with those countries.
And so you did press work, cultural work, a little bit of everything
Well,
during
yes,
looking back?
as a junior officer trainee, I was and our American Cultural Center was in the suburbs, a suburban community called Cocody in Abidjan, and it was not far from the university, and it was not located that close to the embassy. So I think I did a rotation in the embassy just to learn all the different parts of the embassy. And when I got back to the American Cultural Center, then of course did a little bit of press work, but mainly I was considered an assistant to the cultural affairs staff and did a lot of work with exchange programs, whether they were academic or cultural types of programs, where we had visiting performing artists. We'd help set those up, or we'd have visiting scholars, and we would do what we could to facilitate their stay and make sure that they were comfortable and had what they needed. And the first thing I did when I got there was tell the staff, please don't talk to me in English unless I look like I have no clue what you're saying, because I really want to learn French. Because you get a 3-3 in French in a classroom, which is the equivalent, supposedly, of some level of fluency. But really, it's all the different accents in different places vary. So you have to get your ear used to, acclimate your ear to whatever the local language is, and the different local vocabulary and that kind of thing. So I spent the first year really intensively trying to master spoken French and read it as well, because I had to read newspapers and things like that. And so it was a wonderful experience in that people were very generous. I had the good fortune of meeting a young woman from Ivory Coast in uh, Washington, who worked at the Ivorian embassy, and she sent some hair care products with me to deliver to her family. And so they kind of adopted me, and that was great because it gave me some insights into the culture that I wouldn't have gotten just through the job, and introduced me to lots of people that I might not have met otherwise. So that was a wonderful experience, and it really helped me adjust to my new home, which was a lovely apartment overlooking the lagoon. And it was the nicest place I'd lived in terms of spacious and lots of light coming in and no winter. That was the best part. After growing up in and then living in different drafty old brownstones, it was nice to be in a warm climate.
Awesome. Do tell us more about your Foreign Service experience. What were your other assignments, and what were some of the highlights, and perhaps some of the world events that were transpiring as you served?
Okay, in Cote d'Ivoire, at that time, things were very stable. The longtime president, who had been president since independence, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, he unfortunately didn't really groom successors. Anyone who looked like they were going to rival him, he marginalized or co-opted. And the person that he wanted to see as his successor, Henri Conan Bédier, had been involved in some shady dealings and had been sent off to the US to cool his heels. And subsequently, when Houphouët died and he returned many years later, unfortunately, he did not do well and the country did not do well. But at that time, it was sort of like the golden age in terms of development of the infrastructure. You could travel to most parts of the country on decently paved roads, because every year when there was a celebration of the anniversary of independence, a new road would be built to a new place that was celebrating. And so in that way, a lot of the country got paved, developed, and we did lots of traveling. There is a thing called the Ambassador's Self-Help Fund, where the ambassador can provide funding to help build schools or clinics and things of that nature, actually to buy the materials, and then the villagers or townspeople would provide the sweat equity. They would do the actual building, and the government had to agree to provide the staff for the new building. And so I did a lot of those trips, taking pictures for publicity back when we got back. in our monthly, or maybe it was weekly, I can't even remember now. We did put out a publication and would highlight some of the activities of the embassy and other things. And so those were really eye-opening because I got to see what life was like outside of the capital city. I remember going up to Buake and Yamoussoukro, which was Yamoussoukro is the birthplace of Houphouët-Boigny. And of course, there was a project to build this massive cathedral, which caused such a scandal and uproar, in certain quarters that 60 Minutes went out and did a story on it. But at the time, it had not yet been built, but there was a lot of development in Yamoussoukro. So we traveled all over, including to Yamoussoukro. I think my favorite trip was to one, I think it was Buake, where they had a lot of textile activity, and just the fabrics were just so amazing. Enjoyed seeing that. And also on the roadside up there, sometimes you would see the weavers on the side of the road weaving the long strips of cloth that were then sewn together to make tablecloths and clothing and other things. So the creativity, I just enjoyed seeing that, and all the other creative aspects. And of course, the food, the culinary arts. I enjoyed the futu and sauce-graine and the prawn and the atchike and all those national dishes. There was a place called a locodrome, which was the equivalent of cubed fried plantains with a pepper paste that people snacked on, which is delicious.
Sounds very inviting.
And one of my other favorite places was the flower markets. Oh, they were just so gorgeous. Beautiful flowers of all types. So there's lots of eye candy in Cote d'Ivoire. Then one evening, I get a call asking if I would be willing to cut short my time in Cote d'Ivoire and move to Cotonou, Benin, because there had been an unexpected vacancy and they needed someone there who knew the region and who could speak French and who could move without too much sturm and drang. So off I went to become public affairs officer after only barely 2 years in the Foreign Service. And public affairs officer is the person who is running the entire operation. So, for example, where I was in Abidjan, I was the junior officer trainee, often called the assistant cultural affairs officer. There was a cultural affairs officer, an information officer or press officer, and then the public affairs officer oversaw all of that. And there was another American there, Sue Brown, who recently passed away. She was my sponsor and a wonderful friend who introduced me to Foreign Service life and helped me figure out which end was up and how to move through life in the Foreign Service. She was a wonderful mentor. And she went on to become ambassador to Montenegro and was much loved wherever she worked and wherever she went. Anyway, so that was usually the hierarchy. Public affairs officer was at the top. So there were some places where there was only a public affairs officer or one officer post. And so that's what Cotonou, Benin was. It was the People's Republic of Benin at that time, and they were into Marxism and socialism and had all kinds of political upheaval and instability, many coups d'etats and just a lot of instability. So this was going to be a daunting assignment because there was not much that the American Cultural Center was allowed to do beyond providing English classes. And people had to have government permission to talk to foreigners, and it was so a challenging environment. So the US government had said, well, if we can't do our programs like a normal American cultural center, there's no need for us to be in Benin. And so if we send another person out, you need to let this person be able to actually do the job. So my task was to do cultural programming and academic exchanges and normalize activities at the American Cultural Center. Needless to say, I was like, are you kidding me? and and they said, no, no, no. We have regional officers, we have a regional management person, we have regional librarian, we have regional English teaching officer. We have all these regional people with a lot of experience. They will come through and help you. So you don't have to worry. You will be supported. And this was just when satellite and international telephone calls became much easier. So they said, we'll only be a phone call away. This was pre-email and internet, but they were beginning because we had Wangs in Abidjan and we were just at the beginnings of automation in the State Department. Of course, in 1982, State Department was still pretty far behind other, well, the US government, I think, was still far behind private sector in terms of using technology, but doing its best to catch up. So off I went to my adventure in Cotonou. I came back to the United States for consultations and advice from anyone and everyone I could talk to. Went out and did my best to have exhibitions and luncheons and dinners with speakers and concerts, sometimes collaborating with the French Cultural Center. Got to know my counterparts in the different embassies. There was at that time, the Soviet Union, so there was a USSR embassy, and there was a People's Republic of China embassy. Was allowed to travel to different parts of the country and do programs. We went up country to the northern part of the country at one point and took Charlie Chaplin movies that didn't require dialogue and understanding English, and that was a big hit. So we were able to make headway, and I think the highlight of my time in Benin was when a young Republican mayor, African-American gentleman from Mobile, Alabama area, Pritchard, Alabama, came to Benin to invite the Beninese government to send dancers or any kinds of musicians and cultural representatives to Africatown in Pritchard for their celebration, because Africatown was founded by survivors of the Clotilde, which was the last slave ship to leave West Africa, a clandestine shipment to leave West Africa and land in the US. And the ship was sunk so that there would be no evidence of the crime. And the people escaped. So they were not actually enslaved, as I recall from his story. And that, one of the survivors of that became the book Barracoon by Zora Neale Hurston. But at the time, I wasn't aware of the book. I just was fascinated by Mir Smith's story and served as his interpreter with the president of Benin, Matthew Keraku, at the time, because there was no other, he didn't come with any interpreter. And speaking of interpreting and highlights, one of the highlights of my time in Abidjan was when then, I guess she was in the California Assembly, Maxine Waters came with a delegation of women. They first went to Nigeria, then they came to Cote d'Ivoire. And I also served as her interpreter for one event. which was exhausting, and I had the utmost respect for interpreters. So yes, I met some very interesting people during my time there. Anyway, yes, back to Mayor Smith, who is no longer with us, unfortunately, and I don't think he lived to see some of the um, recent information that has been uncovered about the Clotilde and finding the finding of its remains outside of Pritchard in Mobile Bay, I think. Anyway, that was a fascinating story, and I think after I left is when they were having that Africa Town celebration. It was I was there from 82 to January of 85, and I think that took place sometime in 1985, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, that did go off successfully, apparently, and the Beninese performers were a big hit. So that was Benin, and from Benin, I had applied to posts in Brazil and other parts of Latin America. And I was interested in Brazil because during my time in Benin, there had been a conference of the African diaspora where people from all over the Americas came. And one of the things that I learned during my time in Benin was about the Brazilian returnees who influenced Beninese culture, and how it was also clear how Beninese culture influenced different parts of the U.S. and the Americas in general. My first epiphany was when one of the traditional meals in Benin is called amiwo, which is like a cornmeal preparation. It's molded into a mound, and it's served with either chicken or fish. The cook used to prepare it with grilled chicken, smothered in onions and tomatoes. And it reminded me of a dish my Barbadian grandmother made, which was cuckoo and codfish, which was also, this was okra based though. It was, whereas amiwo is tomato based. The cuckoo was made with cornmeal and okras and other spices. And the codfish was also, salt cod was smothered in onions and garlic and peppers and other kinds of spices. And they were so similar, I said, they've got to have the same. Cuckoo has to come from Benin. And also in Benin, they have a feijoada, but the feijoada is made with black eyed peas rather than black beans. And then they have a sauce feuille, which is greens. And in Brazil, they also have the minced collards, which reminded me of the sauce feuille. So it was always, for me, it was fascinating seeing how all these different cuisines traveled from one part of the world to the other. And you could see the DNA of African cuisine in so much of cuisine in the Americas.
So did you get an assignment to Brazil?
No.
Ah.
After all of that effort, they called me up and said, "We're so sorry, we can't give you your assignment in Brazil, but would you mind going to Panama?" Which had been last on my list. I didn't think I'd get it, but I just put it on there just for the heck of it. So I was so excited. I would get to learn Spanish. I would get to spend time with my relatives who lived there. I had visited once after graduation from college. And so I was just thrilled that I would finally get to go back home, as it were, and experience the land of my parents' birth. So after that, after my assignment in Benin, I did round the world trip home because my sisters were living in the Bay Area, and that was my home leave address. Because by then my father had sold our brownstone in Brooklyn and moved to Florida. And so I went to visit friends who were assigned to Bangkok, and then visited another friend who was assigned to Taiwan. And that was in February. So I got to experience Chinese New Year's in Taiwan, which was incredible. And flew back home through Japan, through the airport in Japan. And after my home leave, went to Washington and started studying Spanish. And after I successfully passed my Spanish exams, off I went to Panama. And as I had done in West Africa, I asked everyone in Panama to please speak to me in Spanish so I could figure out my way through with the language and try to blot out the false cognates in French. And by then, my brain seemed to have had a system for language learning because I had already studied German and spent time in German-speaking countries. So when I got to French training, I already had sort of a way of managing learning a language. And so Spanish was even easier because my brain was used to doing that kind of thing. So off I went, would spend weekends with my aunt and uncle who lived in Colón province. And during the week, of course, be busy working, doing whatever I needed to do as a press officer, an information officer in Panama. And Panama proved to be quite an adventure. When I got there, things were pretty calm and not a lot of drama.
What year was this?
This was 1985. I got there in July of 1985. And in September, I think it was September, the whole world got turned upside down. When I arrived, it was a period when the U.S. was kind of at loggerheads with the Panamanian government because even though there was a president, the real power was General Manuel Antonio Noriega. And he could change who was in the presidency at will, which he did. And so things got really difficult when one of his most ardent critics named Hugo Spadafora was murdered, and his headless body was found near the Costa Rican border. And the whole world press contingency descended on Panama. And so our office was just working like crazy, managing all the requests for briefings by different people in the embassy. And it was just nonstop craziness. And it didn't let up for the next 4 years. I was assigned there for 4 years because it was at that time a non-hardship post. And so U.S. Information Agency had longer assignments than the State Department because they really wanted us to be steeped in the culture and make good connections and understand the culture. And you can't do that in just a couple of years. It really takes time. So I was there for a 4-year roller coaster ride, and things just were topsy-turvy after that. There was civil unrest and the opposition protesting a lot, and the Spadafora family, which was quite prominent, began lobbying the U.S. and the U.S. Senate and other bodies to investigate the murder and to hold someone accountable. And yeah, it was chaotic at times. And then we had a lot of reporters coming down, many of whom were not foreign correspondents and didn't really understand the local culture. And so part of the job was trying to put them in touch with people who would help give them some context and history and explain irritants, local irritants, and frictions between the U.S. and Panama, but also even within Panamanian society. So it was uh, quite an experience. And when I got down there, I got involved with the Society of Friends of the West Indian Museum because of my background and common interests. And so many of those members were very helpful in explaining things to people who were visiting, but also to me, who had not grown up there. And so there were lots of things that I didn't make sense to me. But between my family members, my cousins and my aunts and uncle, and the friends of the Western Museum, and then other people that I met along the way, I got a really good sense of what was going on and why people were upset and things of that nature. So I got a lot of insights from friends and family who, again, normally wouldn't be involved with embassy activities, but still had very valid and important points of view and helped put a lot of things in historical context.
Wonderful. What next?
So 4 years in Panama. All this time, I was a single person. And toward the end of my tour of duty there were elections, and those it was the election campaign season was just really messy because the opposition was very vocal in their discussion of the sins of the Noriega regime. And there were these militant groups that were supported by the military that would go out and sometimes face off with the opposition. And there were people in communities who would inform the government of activities of opposition folks. So there's a lot of tension. And then I think at some point, because of the outspokenness of some of the government, the U.S. government employees, some of them were threatened, so some had to get bodyguards. And that included the public affairs officer, a gentleman named Terrence Kneebone, and his bodyguard also worked for one of the presidential candidates, Billy Ford, Guillermo Ford. And at one point, there was altercation, and the bodyguard was killed, and it was horrible. And his blood was on Billy Ford's shirt, and that photograph appeared on the cover of Time magazine. It was pretty awful. So yeah, there was a lot of violence, political violence, and the elections eventually were held. And as part of the U.S.'s involvement down there, we had a delegation come, and I think the Carter Center had a delegation, and so the State Department sent staff to also be with the delegation, provide advice, because I believe that was the early days of Jimmy Carter observing elections. And so one of the people who was sent down there worked in the public affairs section of the State Department and came over he was going to be the press liaison for the delegation. He came over to our office and worked with us. And that's how I met my husband. It was him, Steve Johnson. And at the time, we were just, working together, colleagues. And but when I came back to the U.S., he had said, "If you ever come back to the States, give me a ring and we can go to lunch," which I did, and we did. And then we went to dinner. And a year and change later, I think we got married. So, and we've been married for 30-something years. So that was,
Congratulations.
thank you. That was an unexpected occurrence during my time in Panama. I was actually there until the end of May, I think, 1989. I was originally supposed to leave in July of 1989, but because of all the political upheaval, they drew down the staff at the embassy after the elections, which were deemed not free and fair. And there was just a lot of tension that culminated in December of that year in the operation that unseated General Noriega. And I guess you could say the rest is history. So I came back to the U.S. in May of 1989 and went to work in the Office of African Affairs because I decided Latin America was just too crazy. And I decided I wanted my next assignment to be Senegal. So I just went back to work in the Office of African Affairs as the Francophone West Africa desk officer, with every intention of bidding on Senegal and other West African countries in the future. Oh, that kind of got sidetracked by marriage because my husband said, "Well, I don't speak French, but I do speak Spanish," because he had been in the Air Force and he had been a pilot and had served in Honduras as an attaché flying the generals from one part of Central America to another. And so he spoke Spanish and he said, "Why don't we just go to Latin America?" So we changed course and went to Uruguay and then El Salvador before we returned back to the US. And so, yes, we, after all my plans for Senegal went by the wayside, I originally they were wanting to send me to Haiti, but I had a baby and it was an unaccompanied post. So I said, well, that's not going to work. So we're going to have to find someplace else. So that's how I ended up going to Montevideo, Uruguay. And that was also a 4-year assignment. And I spent 4 fascinating years in that country because the southern cone of Latin America is very different from, say, Central America and northern South America. There were many more immigrants from Europe, and it was more Europe facing than US facing. A lot of Basques, a lot of Italians, Germans, of course, and I think many of the citizens had dual Italian, Uruguayan, or Spanish Uruguayan citizenship. And so like I said, 4 years there working again in the embassy as a public affairs officer with a press officer and a cultural affairs officer. And we had a binational center where English classes were offered, and it had a library. It had a nursery school, a bilingual nursery school. I mean, it was a really active organization. And these were in the days of, this was, let's see, 1990s. These were in the days of budget cuts, where the U.S. thought it had won the Cold War, therefore they didn't need to win hearts and minds in the same way that they had during the Cold War. So a lot of programs were scaled back, and we lost numerous positions. There had been an assistant cultural affairs officer in charge of the binational center, and that position was eliminated. And then the press officer position was eliminated. So it was just two officer posts, public affairs officer and cultural affairs officer. And eventually they had this wonderful idea that the US shouldn't be running libraries overseas in the way that they had been in the past. And so they wanted to bring the reference library service into the embassy and let the Binational Center run its own library. Oh, it was a mess. It was horrible because I tried to explain, no. You still need to engage foreign publics. You still need to help people understand the United States and why it's doing what it's doing. And if you're not present, you can't speak to people, you can't engage people. And this is the wrong move. Well, needless to say, they paid no attention to me and really scaled back things and cut back things. And that was basically the low light of my time there, having to let people go and pull back from programs that were successful. There was a successful theater program at the Binational Center. A play that was performed there won the equivalent of the Uruguayan Tony Award. I mean, it was just called the Florencio. And it was just really sad to see dismantling of an effective program. So I guess the highlight of that assignment was when Terence Blanchard came to perform. We brought Terence Blanchard to perform in Uruguay before he blew up and became super famous. And he was just as gracious and wonderful as could be. And so after 4 years there, we went to El Salvador, which was experiencing lots of positives after the Civil War had finally ended and the country had decided that one way to build national unity would be to create a museum that celebrated all the different parts of El Salvador. And so they started on this project, and the U.S. Information Agency assisted with bringing museum specialists there to support them and give them information on security and on presentation, all the different aspects of creating a great museum. Folks from Smithsonian and other institutions came down. So that was one of the highlights. Also, working to mend the relationship with the Catholic University after years of distance because of the murders of the workers at the Catholic University in San Salvador during the Civil War. So there were lots of good things that happened in terms of building relationships and mending fences and creating new paths for communication. So I only spent 2 years there, but
What years
they were from 1996 to 1998.
Mm-hmm.
And those were also great years in El Salvador in terms of I mean, there were always security problems. You know, you always have petty crime and things like that. But things were so much calmer than they are these days. And part of the problem from my point of view is that when the then Clinton administration decided to send plane loads of individuals who had recently been incarcerated for violent crimes in the US, send them back to El Salvador, deport them basically, some of whom had never lived there as adults. And their Spanish wasn't that great. They were full of tattoos and kind of scared people. And the US didn't really alert the Salvadoran government that this was about to happen. So they were not prepared to receive them and help them reintegrate or integrate into the society. It was just a mess. Eventually, some notice was given, but it was kind of too little too late. And those were the seeds of the upheaval that we're still experiencing to this day. And it's really sad to see because they were making progress in rebuilding the country. This just undermined everything they were trying to do. And that was my last overseas assignment. After that, I returned to the US. And because one of my children had a speech and language disorder that required speech therapy, the State Department doctor said that I should, if I went overseas again, I should only go to an English-speaking country. And by that time, I decided, well, I would just come back to the States and serve until retirement, because by then I wasn't that far away from the eligibility for retirement. And
I'm smiling now because I heard someone in this interview say, I thought I might do it for 5 years.
exactly.
And then you got captivated and
Yes.
ended up spending how many years as an officer?
In active duty, I spent 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
And when I retired, I still was young enough to have another job, and I still enjoyed the work I was doing. So I went back as a rehired annuitant and worked for another 15 years as a rehired annuitant in different positions.
But
And
the domestic side this time.
domestic side. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, as a rehired annuitant, you can go overseas, but I chose only domestic types of work. And that was an interesting adventure. But back to my active duty days. So at that point, I was not old, even though I had, I think by then, let's see, yeah, I had the time in service. I didn't have the age. So I went to work in an office that was called the Office of Strategic Communication. And we were attached to the U.S. Information Agency Director's Office. And I received the Justice and Law Enforcement portfolio and the Latin WHA, the Western Hemisphere Affair Bureau's portfolio, because of my experience in the Western Hemisphere and my experience dealing with a variety of justice and law enforcement issues. One of the things I had done while in El Salvador, I was watching TV one Saturday afternoon, watching the local news in El Salvador, and saw this crazy, chaotic scene outside of a police station with journalists trying to interview someone who was being arrested. And I contacted one of my colleagues who was working at the police academy in El Salvador that the United States was trying to, they were basically facilitating and supporting the academy, and had specialists who came down, and they had an office that was charged with working with the police academy on curriculum and things like that. And so I asked my colleague, my law enforcement colleague, are you all teaching the police officers how to deal with the media? And he said, no. I said, well, maybe we can help. And so I think we got funding from the U.S. Agency for International Development because I think they were the ones who were funding some of the police training. And we were able to bring two journalists, one from Telemundo in California and another from a Chicago station, both Spanish speaking. And they came down and we put together a program. No, actually, there were three. Two spoke Spanish, one did not. I can't remember now. But at any rate, we brought down three people and we ran a series of classes separately. First for the police officers on how to engage with and manage the media and how to tell their story and communicate with the public. And then we had another set of classes for the journalists and others in public information offices on how to work with the police in terms of respecting police lines and ground rules and things like that, privacy issues. And then we had them all come together. And it was a really interesting experience. And both sides said that they got a lot out of it and had a better understanding of the roles of each of the other party. And you could see the difference in subsequent news reporting as well. So that was one of my experiences, I think, that made this justice and law enforcement portfolio of interest to me. And let's see, I had also had some experience working on public affairs for for local interlocutors. When we were in Uruguay, my husband, who was in the Air Force Reserves as a public affairs officer, he got together with the Uruguayan Air Force because they had helped us out with a visit of the Thunderbirds to Uruguay. And after the visit, I invited them over to the house for lunch to thank them. And they mentioned that they did not have any formal training in public affairs and wondered what the American military did. And so my husband was in a great position to explain. And so the colonel who was running that Office of Public Affairs said, I have a desk for you. I want you to come out and help us put together a course. And so my husband got the Army Public Affairs Manual. Our office helped with translation and other things. And so he and the Uruguayan military and some Uruguayan public affairs, a public relations specialist that our press assistant in the senior press FSN in our Foreign Service National, Uruguayan National in our office helped facilitate that meeting. And our office helped facilitate a number of things. They published a workbook or a manual in Spanish, which was the first that had ever been done in Latin America. And this is like in the 1990s. And you would have thought something like that would have been done before, but it wasn't. And so then my husband took this course and they fine-tuned it. They got Southern Command to approve it. They reviewed it and they made a few changes, but they basically said, yeah, go for it. And not only did he run the course in Uruguay, he ran it in several other countries in Latin America. And it was basically helping the military understand how to speak to the public, but also how to do proper internal communications. And it ended up being adopted by the military in many different Latin American countries as a way understanding the role of military in a democracy. So all of those things came together in this position where the different ways of dealing with explaining justice and law enforcement to foreign audiences was part of the goal. And coordinating US government activities to support the there was this there was this thick book that I had to read when I first started the job about uh, justice and law enforcement priorities of the US government. And so my job was to get to know the different agencies within the federal government that were involved and find ways for our offices to support their efforts overseas in terms of informing publics about our goals. And one of my jobs was to support the first ever vice presidential anti-corruption conference that was going to be held at the State Department later that year or maybe the next year. I can't remember what, but I spent a long time working on that because we had to put together a panel and do other things to support it and help with the publicity for it. And that was quite an experience. And I learned all kinds of things about the interagency process and met many interesting people involved in law enforcement, not just in the bureaus in the State Department that were responsible for that, but also other agencies as well, DEA, FBI, the Department of Labor, and that kind of thing.
DEA?
Drug Enforcement Agency.
Thank you. We
The
know
FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Labor. I mean, there are just all these different agencies that had a role to play in enforcing US laws or respecting the laws of other countries and coordinating enforcement efforts and that kind of thing. And also there were many offices that were involved in training police forces in foreign countries to respect human rights and that kind of thing. So it was quite an experience. We met a lot of interesting people. And working on that conference was all consuming. And but we were able to do all that we had set out to do, and it was a success. And I think that that's probably why I got promoted to the Senior Foreign Service, because I certainly didn't expect to be promoted to the Senior Foreign Service. But the write-up that my boss did of my performance on my performance evaluation, I guess convinced people that I was worthy of a promotion.
And I take it this was Vice President Gore?
Yes. And I even have a photo of Vice President Gore shaking my hand. They made us all line up in the hallway, and he just went down the line shaking hands, and they took pictures, and then they sent us pictures afterwards as a thank you, which was nice. It was a nice touch.
Mm-hmm. So was that your final Foreign Service assignment?
No. After that, I went to work in the West. During that time, the U.S. Information Agency was taken over by the State Department. The late Senator Jesse Helms had this bee in his bonnet about consolidating USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, U.S. Information Agency, into the State Department. The head of U.S. International Agency for Development, Brian Atwood, was not in agreement with that and fought it successfully. On the other hand, Joseph Duffy the head of USIA didn't seem to care. And so we were absorbed by the State Department and atomized throughout the State Department. And although our office argued to stay together so that we could help coordinate within a much larger bureaucracy, coordinate messaging for foreign audiences, that was seen as just our resistance to this merger rather than an attempt to ensure a coherent process of message coordination in a much larger entity. And so everything was broken up and scattered throughout the State Department. There was an undersecretary for public diplomacy and public affairs, but that person did not have much of a staff and certainly did not have a coordinating role as the director of the U.S. Information Agency through his Office of Strategic Communication had. So it was a real rocky transition. And when 9/11 happened, it became very clear that some kind of coordinating function was needed because the then Undersecretary, Charlotte Beers, had come from the private sector. And so the government was a whole different animal, and coordinating messaging was a whole different ballgame in government as opposed to in a corporation. So that was a difficult time. And by the time the merger took place, I ended up going to work for a time in an office that did programming for the embassies, finding speakers and placing them, providing support materials and things of that nature. I think it was called the International Information Programs Office. And I was there for a few months and then transitioned to a new assignment in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs in the actual State Department building. And it was the Office of Public Affairs and Public Diplomacy, so within the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. So our office reported to a deputy assistant secretary within what they call the front office of the Western Hemisphere Affairs Bureau office. And our administrative management person also moved over there with us because there was still some firewall between our budget and the State Department budget so that our budget wouldn't be totally decimated. And that person's job was to keep track of budget issues and make sure that the money was spent as it was supposed to be spent. And it was 1999 was when that merger took place. And I was in that office, I guess, for 2 years, and then transitioned to an office in the personnel section, which had become the Bureau of Human Resources. And I was what they would call a career development officer, which was basically someone who worked with a certain part of the alphabet to help the individuals who were looking for assignments in different parts of the world. And we were sort of like a career counselor and data entry clerk, because we had to enter all the information on who was bidding or applying to go to different posts. And for people who remained unassigned after this assignment cycle, we had to help them find jobs. So I did that for, I think it was another 2 years, and then went to work at the Foreign Service Institute as my final active duty assignment. And I was one of the instructors in the press unit of the public diplomacy training office. And so we helped train people who are going to go out to become information officers or press officers in the embassy. And we also ended up organizing a course for more experienced officers to examine public diplomacy in the current state of it, the current state of communications, and sort of find ways to identify what research was being done on communication and the new trends in communication strategies and public relations and things of that nature. So I joined the Public Relations Association of America to get a better sense of what those professionals were learning to compare to what might be helpful to our public affairs officers, and met some, again, interesting people who we invited to speak to our group. And although public relations is different from public affairs, there are some commonalities. And so I thought it made sense to compare and contrast and share experiences. And I did that for, I guess, until 2005, when I formally retired from active duty and then picked up different odd jobs as a rehired annuitant, working first for a little bit at the Foreign Service Institute, and then going to work in the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs, which was a totally new universe for me. But they needed a cultural coordinator because the person they had a vacancy and they needed someone to just fill in. So I did that for, I can't remember how long, but I did that for a little bit. And what else did I do? I ended up, I think I took 1 year off and then went back and ended up working in the Freedom of Information Act office. And that's where I spent the last 7 years of my time working for the federal government. And that was quite an adventure because in the 7 years I was there were three new reorganizations, often to try to improve productivity, none of which worked because it was just such an overwhelming number of demands being made on the State Department for materials. So it was, all in all, quite an adventure. And the thing I learned and told people from my experience working in the FOIA, or Freedom of Information Act office, is whatever you write will come back to bite you if it's stupid. So please think before you hit send. And one of my philosophies throughout my career was it's always better to go to someone face to face if you can and just chat about whatever the issue is than to send a note. Because a face-to-face conversation can often resolve things or result in solutions much more quickly than a back and forth in email or text or whatever. So whenever I was, whatever job I had, I always walked around and talked to people. You'd bump into folks in the hallway, end up with a conversation that sometimes would help you solve a problem that you were trying to figure out. I mean, there's just nothing like the human touch, human contact, human interaction. And to me, that is the most important part of diplomatic work, the human factor, the human interaction. People know if you care. And you show that you care when you show up consistently, not just when you need something, but when you don't need anything and just want to see how somebody's doing. I mean, I would go visit some of my counterparts and contacts in the different countries, not because I wanted anything from them, but just to see how they were doing, find out what they were up to, share what I was doing, and see if there are any things that we could possibly work on together that would be mutually beneficial. And folks appreciated that. It's so important. And with all our technology, which has um, made human interaction even more difficult, I think, um, we would do well to remember that it's the last 3 feet that make the most difference. I think Edward R. Murrow said that back in the day, and it is still true. An office visit will make all the difference in the world.
Well, as we're rounding up this fascinating interview, I want to give you an opportunity to look into that camera and speak to the future. What do you have to say about playing the Angels game? Or what would you say to that person who's watching this recording in the future about diplomacy?
It goes back to what I just said. Diplomacy is about human interaction in the final analysis. It's, do you understand the other person's point of view? Have you put yourself in their position? Do you know what is motivating their behaviors and their opinions? Because sometimes if we can understand how another person is thinking and feeling, we can better communicate what we're trying to achieve. And sometimes you have to just agree to disagree. And there's no harm or crime in that, because we can't always agree on everything. But I think respect for the viewpoints of others is critically important. And no matter what the age, there's a Maya Angelou quote about people may not remember what you did, but people will remember how you made them feel. Make other people feel valued. To me, that is the most important thing, that you let people know that you care. Even if you don't agree, it's okay. But be respectful and be caring. Have compassion and empathy, because that's in too short supply most days.
Thank you. That is a powerful note to end on. We appreciate your contribution.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts.